Well, Dr. Kathleen DuVal, welcome to the show today.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's a real pleasure to be here.
We are so excited to have you, and I am really excited to unpack our question today, which is about colonial life prior to the American Revolution. And so, our central question for today is how did social, economic, and political forces shape life in colonial America before 1763? Now, that's obviously a very small question that, of course, we can answer immediately. But I wonder, just at this jumping off point, what things come to mind for you when you hear that question?
Well, I think when we jump too quickly to the revolution, we focus in on the 13 colonies that rebelled. So let me sort of lay out geographically and demographically kind of what the continent looks like, right? Because those 13 colonies are a very small part of North America. So the British Empire by the mid 1700s has about 26 colonies. Sometimes the borders change, but roughly twice as many as the 13 we usually only count. So colonies in Canada, the 13 colonies that do end up rebelling. There are colonies in the Caribbean, and then also after the 7 Years' War, which is skipping a little bit after 1763, they'll have East and West Florida, so other mainland colonies as well. But then the rest of the continent has lots of other people on it. There are, before 1763, the large middle of the continent, the Mississippi Valley on both sides of the Mississippi River, is French Louisiana. To the north is French Canada. In the west are Spanish colonies, New Mexico, Texas. Florida is also Spanish until 1763. And then on the ground, as even European maps would have showed you at the time, most people are Native American. Native Americans in the 1700s lived in hundreds and hundreds of different nations, communities, thousands and thousands of different Native towns. Native Americans are, until 1750, most of the population of North America, and Native nations will actually control most of the continent until far after that, maybe another century after that.
I think that that's really important for us to note, because when we think of colonial America, I do think that more often than not, especially in standards for K-12 educators as they are teaching across the United States, there is this huge emphasis on the 13 colonies. And really, though, North America is this international expanse of people and nations who are interacting with each other in this, expansive geographic multi-empire land.
That's exactly the way to put it, Sam. And it's an international place, right? Other European empires and native nations as well, who are also sovereign, independent nations.
Yeah, and I think too, I think in my mind, maybe I did assume this, but I don't know if I've ever said it out loud to my students that prior to 1750, most of the population of North America, right, were Native people.
Yeah.
And I think that that really shifts our understanding of the dynamics in the continent prior to 1763.
Right. And one of the things I think also to stress to students is that there are large numbers of Native Americans living within the colonies, and who are, go to church with and do business with their colonial neighbors. And then, of course, most Native Americans live still in their own independent nations across the rest of the continent.
Yeah, so let's unpack a little bit more about what colonial America or early America looked like before 1763. So when we think about this world, we mentioned that we should be picturing a really international place. But besides Native Americans, people of African descent, obviously, who had been forcibly imported or born in America prior to 1763, and of course, English settlers, French settlers, Spanish settlers, what does life look like for these people? What is kind of daily life in early America looking like before 1763?
Yeah, so most people live in the place they were born in, right? So there are absolutely immigrants coming in from Europe all the time. But most people have a pretty small world, right? They know their neighbors. They are connected to Atlantic trading networks. That's true for every kind of people on the continent, Native, European, and African. But it comes to them pretty locally, right? So they may use imported goods, but they've never been to Europe themselves or Africa themselves, right? Most people live pretty local lives and think of themselves in those terms. Like they may be part of the British Empire or part of the French Empire, but they think of themselves more as, say, Virginians or maybe even people of Williamsburg, right? At the same time that they see themselves, particularly British colonists, see themselves as part of an important player in the world. They see themselves as Britons while also defining their everyday lives and identities as local.
I think it's really fascinating to think about how geography is shaping the experiences of people in early America. And it's really interesting to think about them as having sort of touch points with a transatlantic world, but that day to day, their lives are incredibly small. Is there a huge difference in, and let's sort of focus maybe on English settlers for a moment. Is there a huge difference in the day to day life for people in Massachusetts versus people in Virginia or South Carolina? Because I know in classrooms, we are really taught to hone in on the geographic regions of these 13 colonies.
Yeah. Well, I think the way, we tend to teach that as geographic regions makes a lot of sense. Their day to day lives, I think, from our perspective, are pretty dang similar. Right? They're so different from our lives, for one thing. They mostly are get their living off of farming in some way or another, or sort of the next remove from farming in some sort of trade or import export, right? They are connected to trade networks both across the Atlantic and into the interior, if you think about Indian trade. But they do tend to think of themselves as different from one another, to think of themselves regionally. And so I think they would say they are more different from one another than we would say they are.
In Native nations, you start the book with this really beautiful story about a supernova in the spring of 1006. And you sort of position people around the world's fixation with the star as a marker of their shared humanity that sort of transcended geography. Was there anything that sort of bound people living in colonial America together prior to the revolution?
So I think one of the things I would point to is stuff, like imported things. People in the 1700s had developed a real culture around imported goods and sort of saw those as part of their daily life. So we could take sort of things surrounding tea, for example. Most people had some way of making and serving tea in the colonies. Most colonial households had a teapot and all the other accoutrements that go with tea. And that would have been very similar from one colony to another colony. And even many native households by the mid 1700s have a tea set or some other sort of silver serving dishes. I think one of the things that's important to remember is there had been Atlantic trade into North America for a long, long time. By 1750, right? We're talking 100 years, so several generations of people learning to use European goods, developing trade, um, establishing in Virginia tobacco plantations or in a native town, maybe processing deers and hides. Um, this was a world economy that touched everybody. And so I'd say that's something that kind of people have in common across most of the continent.
I think that's such a good point that I think would really resonate with students because I think sometimes, especially when we're trying to get through again, like the standards of learning and stuff. We're just hitting all of the big things and these big sort of concepts, which are really important, obviously. But the idea that material culture is something that really connects individuals throughout North America, I think is something that our students can really understand from kindergarten to being seniors. What is something that is in their homes that is probably in every other home, in America, right?
Yeah.
And that's generate cool.
Yeah. Yeah. It also is a good way to bring in women's history and the history of children, just that, everybody, saw these things in their home, not just the sort of famous men of the American Revolution.
I'd love to sort of unpack a little bit too. I spent some time on Native nations. What did interdependence look like for Native nations? And how did Native nations clash or connect with the British Empire prior to 1763?
Right. So I think, especially when we were explaining this to students, it's kind of a balance between saying, okay, these are independent sovereign nations in the same way that the United States will declare itself an independent sovereign nation. But any nation, whether it's the United States or Native nations on the continent, they need both the recognition of other nations. You really can't call yourself a nation unless other nations recognize you as a nation. And they need trade and diplomacy and alliances if they're going to go to war. And so this is also a place of this interdependent, interlocking system of Native nations and colonies that once there's the United States, will need to be part of in some way or another. And so those Native nations, especially those that are if we're sort of focusing in on those that are on the border of the British colonies, they, for the most part, are allied with either the British or the French, and in some cases the Spanish, as the Spanish are starting to move into the region. But they also are working for their own purposes, right? Their own agendas. And so they ally with multiple European empires if that's to their advantage. And then, of course, alliances between Native nations, among Native nations, are also really important.
So approximately, how many Native nations did exist in colonial America? And I know that changes obviously over time, because when we say early America or colonial America, I mean, we could be talking about hundreds, thousands of years, right?
Right. Yeah. So there are about a dozen different language families in North America. Language families that are as different from one another as German and French, right? And maybe as different from each other as Chinese and French. And within those are many, many different polities that are not necessarily allied and certainly that don't see themselves as the same kind of people, even though they speak related languages. So that's just to give an idea of the intense diversity and multiplicity of Native nations. So you sort of estimate, say, how many Native nations there are in say, 1750. And it's complicated because some are sort of confederacies of multiple nations and such. But I think we can safely say in the thousands across the continent, across North America. If you're looking at those right on the border of the British colonies, or in a couple of cases within the British colonies, so say the Catawbas, for example, who are still an intact sovereign nation, but surrounded by South Carolina, still looking at a good 20, 30. And that's at the highest level. Even within those nations, you would find different towns, different bands that aren't always on the same page as far as their foreign policy goes, say.
I wonder, one question that I have gotten from many students, which occurs both when we study early America, and it also occurs when I've had students studying the European colonization of Africa, is why don't we see more alliances between Native nations in order to combat the encroachment of European people and powers?
Yeah, it's a terrific question and a really great one to talk through with students. First of all, we do see some. And so it's really when the British colonies and then the United States start to have such a commanding population. Like just by the numbers, there are more British colonists than their native neighbors can quite imagine. Like the British colonies are doubling in population every generation between sort of the early 1700s and well into the 19th century. And so we do see the beginnings of some pretty strong alliances against that. It's sort of that pressure that pushes some alliances in the Ohio Valley. Particularly, those are where some of the strongest ones are. The Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois also try to bring those alliances in the Ohio Valley and others in the north together to be a strong sort of cohesive presence. But sort of imagining that all Native nations have more in common than Europeans or even than just all British is not a natural belief for Native Americans. There is no overarching Native American identity, I would say, until maybe the 20th century, right? So it is military alliances, diplomatic alliances have long existed on the continent before the 1700s, but they are at this point trying to build them with peoples that they have never allied with, have never traded with, have often fought with in the past. So there's a lot of diplomatic work going on in trying to build those, and they're sometimes successful and often not. And then sometimes native prophets go west and try to pull in people in native nations in the west. And I think you can imagine a sort of continent-wide alliance against the British colonies or the United States. But people in the west are like, "What? We don't even know what you're talking about. That doesn't make any sense. That's not a priority for us." And so I think it's hard for Native people in the East to persuade people in the West that this is as big a threat as we, looking back, know that it is. And then I would just say for teachers, when you're talking about that with students, make sure that they also remember that Native nations are still here today. And so don't let them walk into sort of the conclusion that because Native nations didn't band together, that's why they all disappeared or died off. Just there are still over 600 state and recognized tribes in the United States today.
I kind of want to shift our focus a little bit. And because we've been talking about Native peoples, we talked a little bit about English settlers. And so I'm sort of curious, in this Atlantic world, how did slavery affect everyday life in the colonies, both for people of African descent, for white settlers or European settlers, I should say, and also Native peoples? I mean, they are interacting with these systems as well.
Yeah, so slavery is legal everywhere in the colonies. There's no colony that had outlawed slavery until after the Revolution. There are different sizes of populations of enslaved people and of Black people in the colonies. So the southern colonies, because they're plantation colonies, have larger numbers of enslaved people and also larger numbers of people of African descent. There are populations of free people of color in all of the colonies, and there are enslaved people in all of the colonies. And so I think slavery, for the most part, is something that people debate about, whether it is a moral thing to have. And yet there is not yet a cohesive anti-slavery movement. That's something that will happen in the revolution. Slavery is deeply, deeply a part of the economy. That's obvious if you're in South Carolina or in Virginia, but it's also true in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania because of the way Atlantic trade works and the fact that still in these years before the revolution, there were human beings being captured in West Africa, forced across the Atlantic, sold in the Americas, and then those same ships loaded with tobacco and other goods to be shipped back across the Atlantic.
The way you frame that as, these ships being loaded with tobacco, other goods, and people,
Right. Yeah.
I think it really showcases that enslaved people were considered goods. They were considered property during this time.
Yeah, that's right. And I think getting students to understand them being seen as property is really important because sometimes people will say, white people didn't think African people were human, and that is absolutely not true. They absolutely knew they were human, and I think that deepens the moral problem, right? They were not able to convince themselves they were inhuman, but they did absolutely think they could be property. They believed human beings could be property. And that comes from a long, long history of slavery throughout the world that people, when they were enslaved, whatever their ancestry was the word slavery comes from Slav, which reflects that there were Europeans who held Slavic people in slavery. But the idea that human beings can be held as property, can be bought and sold, is I think an important thing to wrap our minds around, because when there come to be anti-slavery movements and then abolition, that is what those activists argue against. That is, it is immoral to consider human beings as property.
Yeah, and I think enslavers, or really any white person who is participating in this economic system, which is to say all people of European descent, right, in some capacity in colonial America. And I think it is really important to say that, they knew that enslaved people were human,
Right.
but they believed that they could be treated as property, which is to say that they attempted to strip the humanity of these people, right?
Yeah, and that is really well put. That's right. That's right.
Well, and you see that sort of argument put in a different way when studying the Holocaust, and there is this attempt, I think, maybe earlier in discourse, like around the Holocaust, where talking about Nazis and saying that they did not believe that people who are Jewish were human, but in actuality, they did know that they were human. And to say that they didn't believe that they were human is actually to remove some responsibility.
I think that's exactly right. But then it's equally important, right, as you said, to say they try to strip them of things that we believe, and they also, would say in good moments, all human beings have a right to, including to keep their children with them.
Mm. Yes. And I think, the separation of families was something that loomed really large in the consciousness of all enslaved people during this time. Would you say that that's true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Because that is what the law said: an enslaved person has no right to their children. They do not have custody over their children.
I do want to talk about gender and how that shaped people's opportunities, roles, and power in this North American continent. So, what did roles look like in terms of gender during this time?
Yeah, so if we focus on the British colonies, the British colonies are under the system of coverture, which basically means if you are a married woman, you have no legal standing in court. Your husband is the legal identity for the household. So that's true also of other people in the household: children, enslaved people, indentured servants. None of them have separate legal identities. But it's particularly poignant for the wife, right? She doesn't have a right to her own wages. So there are women who work for wages, and that money immediately belongs to their husband, according to the law. She doesn't have custody over her children. The husband has custody over the children. She can't sue or be sued, which sounds like maybe a good thing, but that means it's impossible to run a business, right? You can't run a business if you don't have those legal standing. Now, in practice, things were not quite like that. Many, many women, including married women, did run businesses and were very involved in sort of the local parts of their family's trade. There are many women who, whether married or widowed, run taverns, for example. So they're not only running a business, but they're right there when political discussions are happening. And so I think one of the things maybe to understand about gender and the time is that stuff happens pretty close together, right? A business can often also be the family's home. And so there isn't a sort of separate private and public space for most people. And so women really are in public spaces, even though they don't have legal and political rights in the way that most men do. And I should say most men actually don't have political rights. It's still only landowners and some more restrictions than that have political rights in the British colony. And so British law says married women at least can't own property. There are all kinds of ways that people get around it. When a man makes his will, often he will leave property to a daughter. In ways that it's in sort of trust. There are various ways you can, through a will, because it's your property and you can, in some ways, do what you want with it, can effectively allow your wife or even your daughter to own it for all intents and purposes. So I think sort of rather than trying to change the system in the colonial period, individual families worked all kinds of workarounds. And on the ground, there are an awful lot of women who really are effectively owning property. They can't pass it on themselves for the most part to the next generation the way they might choose. Like usually the will says who it will go to next. But for their lifetimes, they are the owners of that property.
We always find a way, That's right. Were gender roles similar for free Black or enslaved women and for Native women as well? Those sort of domestic, more so roles in their families?
So I think you probably say with free people of color and free Black families and sort of white colonial families, their gender roles are actually going to be pretty similar. They're under the same sort of system of law, and also by this point, the same sort of customary divisions of labor in a household, where, as you say, women are sort of closer into the home, doing more of the domestic tasks, often have to work outside the home. And that is what many, many women do in colonial society. But in different kinds of labor, and certainly for different kinds of wages, and with different situations at home. Now, enslavers don't follow their own rules as far as gender goes when it comes to slavery, and they do have enslaved women working in the fields, even though they would say women aren't supposed to work in the fields. Now, there are also white women who work in the fields at certain times of the year just because they need more labor. Certainly poorer white women end up in the fields. But then in household, enslaved people, when enslaved people are working in the households of their enslavers, they are divided by gender. Their work is divided by gender, with the women doing more of the sort of laundry and cooking types of work, mostly within households or within a place like a tavern or such, and enslaved men doing they might be a valet for or the man of the household, but also a lot of the work in colonial towns sort of more outside the home, with horses and curing meats and all kinds of things, would have been done by enslaved men. So enslaved men sort of, if you think about it geographically, tend to have a larger sort of place that they are part of a town that they're part of than enslaved women who are mostly working within homes, and even not their own, the homes that are owned by their enslavers. And the Native families are quite different from that. In most Native American nations, in this sort of part of the continent, labor is divided by gender, and women are the farmers, and women control and plan for and do most of the labor in the fields. They also tend to literally build the houses and do the work of the household and garden around. Men then are mostly responsible for hunting and diplomacy. And then politics sort of follows those. So women tend to be in charge of the parts of politics that are over the fields and the home and the town, that part of the town. And then men tend to be in charge of foreign policy and foreign trade.
In Independence Lost, you write that, quote, being independent would have been unwelcome to most people in 18th century North America. Could you share a little bit more what you mean by this?
Yeah, so the historian Christina Snyder, she describes sort of one of the states of slavery is, and she's building on other people's work in the history of slavery. Um, One of the things about slavery is that you are pulled out of your former ties, your loved ones, your language, all these things that you know, and put into bondage for someone else, for foreigners in a foreign place. And so I think that's a sort of good metaphor for that. That's what you don't want, right? People want to be surrounded by community, by economic ties, by social ties, by family ties. And that applies on a local level to individuals, but it also applies to towns and communities, colonies, native nations, that pure independence wouldn't make any sense. What you want is sort of advantageous interdependence, to know that you have these ties, whether they're on the sort of national level or on the individual level, but that nobody sort of tells you what to do. As you all start to move toward the coming of the revolution, I think it'd be important to see it that way. It's not that independence starts out as being the goal. It's that colonists would like their relationships to be ones that they get to decide, the ones that they're in control of.
Well, wouldn't we all? I think that this question of identity is something that, especially for white colonists, this question of identity of whether or not they were American or whether they were British, or something sort of in between. I think that that's really important to our understanding of the events that lead to the American Revolution.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, yeah. And they, like all of us, they saw themselves as multiple things. But I think if you asked most colonists to put things in order, they would say, maybe their colony first, or maybe their town first, and then maybe the British Empire next. And then, sure, they would say, we are American in that we live on this continent, but that was not a unifying identity in the way that some of the other labels might have been.